So one of the things that I guess I'm curious about out of all that, you mentioned dopamine a lot and serotonin. Have you ever come across somebody that has over too much dopamine? What does that look like? And someone that has very little dopamine, and what does that look like? And same with serotonin and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. And as you asked me that, I realized I failed completely to answer your previous question, like nutrition and supplementation and how those factor into these. So so I'll just briefly say, look, I'm not when previously I had a lab down in San Diego and of Sachin Panda, we should credit Sachin at the Salk he is really the guy who popularized intermittent fasting. You can look up his work about timed eating schedules. Actually, the originator of intermittent fasting was not a scientist, a guy named Ori Hofmeckler, who was in Israeli special forces and then talked about the warrior diet of eating once or twice a day, limited time windows. You can look up Ori's, very nice guy and very deserves credit for really coming up with that. But Sachin's lab has shown real health benefits to having a restricted feeding window every 24 hours. I personally like to eat for a much larger portion of my day. If I restrict my feeding window to 6 hours, I eat everything and I want to explode because I have big appetite. I also just love to eat. So, so if let's say somebody has poor motivation, like they're just not engaging in things, it's interesting because shortening your feeding window will stimulate will stimulate norepinephrine, that kind of sense of agitation. A lot of people find they can focus better. They have more energy if they're not eating so much throughout the day. Some people find the opposite. So you have to kind of play with that. Yes, I'm sorry.
Is that dangerous though?
I mean, I think that, I think it's very clear that you want to have some period of time every 24 hours where you're not ingesting food. Typically that's during sleep, right? But for cellular health and cellular repair, I think the data are now overwhelming that you don't want to be ingesting amino acids and nutrients around the clock. It actually can be quite detrimental. It can, according to Sinclair and others, it can shorten your lifespan. So restricting your feeding window for some people it's 12 hours, for some people it's 10, for some it's 8. I think that low levels, we're not talking starvation, but we're talking about restricting that feeding window can create, like for instance, I push my first meal out to about noon each day. And in the morning, it heightens my sense of alertness because we know it increases things like epinephrine release and adrenaline release. I drink caffeine and coffee in the morning. Now, if you have trouble slowing down at night and sleeping and want to relax, well, that's why I eat my carbohydrates at night, because it will increase serotonin. Things like turkey, white meats, and carbohydrates. The precursor is tryptophan, and then eventually 5-HTP and some other things in the pathway, and then serotonin, which helps you sleep. So there are things that people can do. If people are clinically depressed, they need to talk to a psychologist and or psychiatrist. But typically what psychiatrists will prescribe is either an antidepressant that's of the SSRI variety, meaning selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, things like Prozac, Zoloft, and others. And those increase serotonin. The side effects of those, if they exist, they don't always exist, tend to be lack of appetite, lack of motivation, or lack of libido, those kinds of things. Because if you think about it, you're giving the molecule that is the molecule of satiety and feeling fine. So why would you have to go pursue the things that would ordinarily lead to those? The other variety of antidepressants, things like Wellbutrin, tend to stimulate dopamine and norepinephrine release. They tend to make people in pursuit of things, tends to make people feel agitated, tends to make people feel kind of upstate, in kind of an up state of mind. But it can increase anxiety. So if you see somebody who's taken methamphetamine or taking cocaine, you're looking at somebody who's bathed their brain in dopamine. And what you'll find is that they're always thinking about the next thing. They'll talk fast. They're thinking about the thing that's out there in the world. People who have taken a drug that gives them high levels of serotonin, they're going to basically not want to go do anything except things that are more of the like eat food, just be here, amotivated. So if someone's clinically amotivated and clinically depressed, I mean, they need to be very cautious about what, drugs that are going to push them in one direction or the other. I certainly don't recommend recreational drugs to anybody, but because A, they're illegal, and B, they really do cause terrible effects. But moving that feeding window and what you eat can have an effect. Some people will supplement. Now, I should say that my lab doesn't work on these things, and I want to be very clear, I'm not a physician. So if you're going to pursue any of the supplementation regimes that I'll talk about in a moment, you definitely want to talk to a physician. I'll mention a website that is completely not for profit. I have no affiliation with them anyway, but called examine.com, where you can put in any supplement. It will give you links to the PubMed studies related to those supplements. So it has what's called the human effect matrix, describes a lot of the effects. So like for people that have trouble sleeping, for instance, things like magnesium threonate, theanine, promote the release of things like serotonin and GABA, which tends to shut down our thinking, allow people to fall asleep and stay asleep. Milk of magnesia, the same reason why they say a glass of milk before bed or something like that. For people that have trouble with motivation and focus, I think it's a mistake to run out and start taking Adderall and taking stimulants unless a doctor has deliberately prescribed that for you and they know you very well and there's a real need. But there are amino acids like tyrosine, things like caffeine, which we all, caffeine, to increases norepinephrine, right? Basically, reduces adenosine load, that kind of thing, to make me less sleepy. Things like L-tyrosine to promote a little bit of release of dopamine for occasional use. Caffeine I use every day, but I don't go around kind of dosing myself with amino acids to increase my dopamine levels because I want my own dopamine levels to be working for me. So there are tools out there and you can explore for those, but ultimately the behavioral tools are going to be the best ones. And let's face it, the best thing for mental health, get a good night's sleep. You have trouble sleeping? Well, get off your phone at 10 p.m. and maybe consider taking magnesium threonate and theanine and make sure you eat a decent carbohydrate-rich meal in the evening. If you have trouble with motivation and focus, well, then consider maybe pushing your eating window a little bit away from the time in which you want to focus, drinking some caffeine. You might consider pursuing something like, supplementing with L-tyrosine occasionally, but better to not have to supplement with anything. The reason I mention all this is that what's starting to emerge, as perhaps you've noticed as I'm talking, is that you've got these neurochemical systems that pull you towards sleep and rest, serotonin and GABA, that pull you towards effort and focus and drive, dopamine, norepinephrine, that pull you toward being a total vegetable, not wanting to do anything. That's the opioid system. I mean, the opioid system, the reason it's so bad when it's triggered with drugs is the opioid system was designed to trickle out tiny bits when you've been in long duration effort. It's a painkiller that was designed so that you and I could go hunt for 3 days. And on the third day, when we're like, look, this sucks, this is terrible, my foot hurts. And all of a sudden you're like, I'm just going to endure, and you push on. That's not dopamine. That's the opioid system coming to give you some pain relief. So when people are taking these opioids, they're just basking in this like world of pain, everything gone. They're numb. They're like, their neurology becomes numb. So I'm a fan of always thinking, okay, behaviors and mindsets first, diet and supplementation second. And then if all that is being done more or less correctly most of the time, then perhaps thinking about kind of prescription drug regimens. But the twist in this is that if somebody is clinically depressed, they often can't do the behaviors that are going to get them to the place where they can restore this stuff. And sometimes they need a chemical nudge. And I think provided it's being done with the care and oversight of a really good physician, I think some of those drugs that I mentioned, like this antidepressants, really can help. But I think that there's an over-reliance on them. They should not be the first line of defense. And that's my opinion.